He was supposed to fail. The whole class waited for it, laughed at the idea of it. Even the teacher wanted to see him stumble. But as he stood before the impossible, his fingers twitched. His mind saw patterns no one else could. And in that moment, everything changed. What happened next left the entire room silent. Stay tuned. At the front of the room, Mrs. Lancaster stood with military-like stiffness, her cold blue eyes scanning the classroom for the slightest hint of disobedience. Her sharp gaze landed on Ethan Reyes. The boy sat in his usual far corner, his shaggy brown hair shielding his eyes as he hunched over a battered notebook. He wasn't paying attention. He never did. While the other students squirmed under Mrs. Lancaster's ruthless questioning, Ethan simply existed, blending into the background like an old chair no one noticed. And she hated it. It wasn't just his silence. It was the way he avoided her eyes, the way he seemed completely unaffected by her authority. Mrs. Lancaster believed that learning required struggle, effort, and submission, and yet Ethan gave her none of it. He was apathetic, a lost cause, and today she had had enough. She tapped her ruler against the chalkboard with a sharp snap. "Eyes up here, class," she barked. Chairs squeaked as students straightened in their seats, all except one. Ethan's pencil continued moving. Mrs. Lancaster's jaw tightened. Jake McAllister, the class bully, noticed the storm brewing and smirked. He leaned over to his seatmate and whispered loud enough for the class to hear. "Look at clueless Reyes, lost in his little diddles again." A few snickers rippled through the classroom. Ethan didn't react. Mrs. Lancaster's patience snapped like a brittle twig. Ethan Reyes. The name slammed against the silent room like a gunshot. Ethan's pencil stilled. Slowly, he lifted his head. His deep brown eyes were calm, expression unreadable. Mrs. Lancaster folded her arms. "Since you seem so disinterested in today's lesson, perhaps you'd like to solve a little problem for the class." A few students exchanged excited glances. They knew exactly what this meant. Jake grinned. Ethan blinked once, then lowered his gaze back to his notebook. He didn't argue, didn't protest. That made Mrs. Lancaster even angrier. She strode forward, her heels clicking like a judge's gavel. Before Ethan could react, she snatched the notebook off his desk. The entire class gasped. Ethan stiffened. Mrs. Lancaster flipped the pages, expecting to see mindless doodles or scribbled nonsense. Instead, her eyes skimmed across numbers, pages and pages of numbers. Equations, symbols, strange patterns interwoven like a puzzle. It was not a child's handwriting. It was something else. Her chest tightened, but she crushed the feeling immediately. This was nonsense. She snapped the notebook shut and set it on her desk. "No more distractions," she said icily. "Come up here, Mr. Reyes." Ethan's fingers curled around the edge of his desk. He didn't move at first. Jake chuckled, kicking the leg of Ethan's chair. "Simon, clueless. Don't keep us waiting." A new wave of snickers. Finally, Ethan stood. His steps were quiet as he walked toward the board, his oversized sweater hanging loosely on his frame. He moved like someone used to going unnoticed. That wouldn't happen today. Mrs. Lancaster picked up a stick of chalk and turned to the board. If he was going to waste her time, she would waste his. With slow, deliberate strokes, she wrote an equation. Not an easy one, not even one from their grade level. No, this was something cruel. A problem so complex that even high schoolers would struggle with it. Mrs. Lancaster stepped back, crossing her arms. "Solve it." The class burst into laughter. Jake whistled. "Oh, you're dead, Reyes." Ethan just stood there. The chalkboard loomed before him, filled with a nightmare. For the first time, his voice broke the silence. "It's done." Mrs. Lancaster snatched the chalk. Her hands trembled as she scanned his work. Her breath hitched. It was correct. More than correct. It was elegant. A method she had never seen before. And suddenly, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Fear. Because what she saw on that board was impossible. But it was real. Ethan Reyes wasn't just some quiet, invisible boy. He was something else. And for the first time in her life, Mrs. Lancaster didn't know what to do. Ethan Reyes stood before the chalkboard, his small frame almost swallowed by the enormous equation looming over him. The symbols stretched across the board like a monstrous, unsolvable riddle, mocking him. The class was waiting for him to fail. Mrs. Lancaster, her sharp blue eyes brimming with condescension, folded her arms and smirked. "Go on, Einstein," she said, her voice laced with mockery. "Show us how smart you are." The students snickered. Jake McAllister, sitting at the front with his usual cocky grin, leaned back in his chair. "Oh man, this is gonna be good." Ethan didn't move. He didn't turn around. He just stared. His fingers twitched. Numbers weren't just numbers to him. They were living things, shifting, dancing, forming patterns that spoke a language only he could hear. Slowly, his breathing steadied. And then, he picked up the chalk. The moment the chalk touched the board, the entire classroom fell silent. There was no hesitation, no pausing, just movement. Ethan's hand flew, his strokes fluid, confident, like an artist painting on an invisible canvas. The laughter stopped. The whispers died. Even Jake's grin slowly faded. The soft scratch of chalk against the board echoed in the silent room, the only sound cutting through the thick, stunned atmosphere. He was too fast. Way too fast. Mrs. Lancaster's smirk twitched, her arms unfolding slightly. What was he? She stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. She expected messy guesswork. She expected random scribbles, the desperate attempt of a child trying to prove he was more than he was. But that's not what she saw. The numbers were perfect. The steps were clean, precise, elegant, effortless. The symbols rearranged like puzzle pieces falling into place. 10 seconds, 20 seconds. He didn't stop. He didn't waver. The problem collapsed into something simpler, smaller, solvable. And then, he finished. Ethan stepped back. He let the chalk drop from his fingers, landing in the tray with a soft clink. And in that moment, the world stopped. The classroom collectively gasped. Jake sat up so fast his chair nearly tipped over. What the? The students stared. Because the board wasn't a mess of frantic numbers. It was something else entirely. A strange, elegant solution. It wasn't just correct. It was better. Mrs. Lancaster's fingers twitched. She grabbed the chalk, her breath unsteady. She scanned his work, checking for errors. She had to find something. There had to be a mistake. But there wasn't. Not a single number was out of place. And worse, he had done it differently. She had taught a completely different method for solving the problem, one that was long and complex. But Ethan, he had found a shorter way, a way that even she had never considered. Her hands trembled. She felt it creeping in. Fear. This couldn't be right. She turned to face him, her expression a storm of emotions. "You," she swallowed. "You've seen this before. You must have." Ethan flinched. "No," he said, his voice soft but certain. Mrs. Lancaster's lips tightened. She looked back at the board. The numbers burned in her mind. No, 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 no. This boy, this nobody, couldn't have done this. This wasn't possible. Her nails dug into the chalk as she turned back to him. Furious. "You cheated," she hissed. "You had to have." But Ethan lowered his gaze. His fingers curled into his sleeves. And then, he spoke. "It's just patterns," he mumbled. Mrs. Lancaster's breath caught. The class stared. "What?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan hesitated, then lifted his eyes, not with arrogance, not with defiance. Just understanding. "I just see the way the numbers move," he said slowly. "It's like they're talking. I don't know how else to explain it." Jake's mouth hung open. The class whispered. Somewhere near the back, a girl muttered, "What does that even mean?" But Mrs. Lancaster knew exactly what it meant, and she didn't want to believe it, because she had seen this before, because she had lost something before, and Ethan Rise was a reminder of everything she had failed to protect. Her jaw clenched. She should be proud. She should be shocked. But instead, she was angry. Her hands went white around the chalk. Ethan had just proven her wrong, and she hated him for it. The classroom buzzed with whispers, students nudging each other, eyes flicking from Ethan to the board. Even Jake was too stunned to speak. Ethan, however, felt small. He didn't want attention, didn't want their stares. He just wanted to go back to his seat. But as he took a step back, he caught something, just for a moment. Mrs. Lancaster's eyes weren't just filled with anger. They were filled with fear, and for the first time, Ethan realized. This wasn't just about a math problem. This was about something else, something bigger, and he had just shattered it. Mrs. Lancaster finally forced words out. "Go back to your seat." Her voice was tight, controlled, but the damage was already done. Ethan hesitated, then turned. As he walked back to his desk, the class parted around him. No more snickers, no more taunts, just silence. And when he finally sat down, resting his hands in his lap, the sun from the window hit his face, and for the first time in his life, he felt seen. The tension in the classroom was suffocating. The chalkboard still bore the evidence of what had just happened. An impossible equation solved effortlessly, beautifully. The whispers of stunned students had died down, but the weight of their disbelief lingered in the air like an unspoken question. The room should have erupted in cheers, in admiration, in stunned applause. But there was only silence. Mrs. Lancaster stood rigid, her fingers clenched so tightly around the piece of chalk that they had turned white. Her lips parted, but no sound came out at first. Then, suddenly, she snapped. "You cheated." The words burst out of her like a slap against the stillness. Ethan, who had just started to shuffle back to his seat, flinched. His deep brown eyes flickered with confusion. He wasn't used to attention, let alone accusations. His fingers curled around the frayed edges of his sweater sleeves. "No, Mrs. Lancaster's breath hitched. Her pulse hammered against her temples. She knew this equation. She knew it because she had chosen it to be unsolvable for a student at this level. And yet the boy, this quiet, forgettable boy, had taken it apart like it was nothing. He hadn't just solved it. He had rewritten the rules, simplified it in a way that was impossible. And it wasn't luck. It wasn't something a child could guess. It wasn't something that should happen. Her fingers twitched. It had happened before. The classroom blurred at the edges, and suddenly, she wasn't standing in room 214 anymore. The cracked chalkboard, the snickering students, the boy before her, all of it dissolved. She was somewhere else. A memory. A kitchen table littered with papers, the soft glow of a desk lamp casting shadows across a boy's face. A boy with sharp eyes, filled with something impossible. A boy who could look at numbers and see what no one else could. Her son, Daniel. Her heart clenched painfully, even as she tried to shove the thought away. It had been years since she let herself think about him. But now, staring at Ethan Rise, it was like looking at a ghost. Daniel had been brilliant. From the moment he could talk, he had understood numbers the way most people understood breathing. She had pushed him, tested him, drilled him. She had made sure his gift didn't go to waste. He had to be the best. And for a while, he was. Until one day, he was gone. Not just physically, emotionally. He had shut down, pulled away. And then, without warning, he had vanished completely. She had searched, made calls, filed reports, but he had never come back. She never knew if it was her pushing that had driven him away, if she had demanded too much, too soon. And now, standing before her was another child, another boy with those same eyes, that same unnatural gift. And it terrified her. Mrs. Lancaster's voice came out sharp, defensive. "You've seen this before," she insisted, her voice trembling with something she couldn't name. "Someone must have shown you how to solve it." Ethan shook his head, his shoulders hunching slightly under her scrutiny. "No." The classroom was completely silent. The students, for once, were too stunned to mock, too afraid to speak. Even Jake McAllister, who lived to humiliate others, just sat there, his smirk gone, his eyes darting between Mrs. Lancaster and Ethan, like he had stumbled into something bigger than all of them. Mrs. Lancaster took a step closer, her voice lower now, unsteady. "Then how did you do it?" Ethan hesitated. His gaze flickered toward the board, then down at the floor. He didn't like speaking. He never had. He had learned a long time ago that silence was safer. But something inside him shifted, something that told him he couldn't stay quiet anymore. He swallowed, his voice soft but steady. "Numbers aren't about being right or wrong," he said. "They're stories." Mrs. Lancaster's breath caught. "I just see them," Ethan continued. His fingers twitched again, as if trying to grasp something invisible. "The way they move, the way they fit together. It's like they're alive. And they tell me where they want to go." The students exchanged looks. Some of them still didn't get it. Some of them probably never would. But Mrs. Lancaster did, because she had heard those words before, years ago, from her own son. She felt her throat tighten. Ethan, unaware of the storm raging behind Mrs. Lancaster's eyes, lowered his head again. "I didn't cheat," he said quietly. "I just saw it." A strange, heavy silence settled over the room. For the first time in his life, Ethan had spoken not out of necessity, but because he wanted to be understood. And nobody knew what to do with that. Jake sat back in his chair, shaking his head. "Dude." It was the only word he could manage. Mrs. Lancaster took an unsteady step back. Everything inside her was fighting itself. She wanted to deny it, wanted to believe this was some trick, some ridiculous coincidence. But deep down, she knew the truth. Ethan Reyes wasn't a fraud. He wasn't just some kid who got lucky. He was something far, far more dangerous. He was the real thing. And that scared her more than anything else. Her son had been the real thing too, and he had been lost. Mrs. Lancaster stared at Ethan for a long time, her pulse pounding in her ears. She could feel her world tilting. Everything she had built. Asterisk, asterisk, her control, her authority, her certainty in who was worthy and who wasn't. Asterisk, asterisk was suddenly crumbling. And Ethan didn't even realize it. For a moment, she thought about saying something, thought about admitting the truth, about telling him that he reminded her of someone. But then, just as quickly, she crushed the thought. She wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, she did the only thing she could do. She glared at him. And then, with a voice colder than before, she said, "Sit down." Ethan hesitated. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his desk. The moment he sat down, the bell rang. Students scrambled to gather their things, whispering as they left. Some cast glances at Ethan, newfound curiosity in their eyes. Jake gave him one last look before shaking his head and walking out. Mrs. Lancaster stood at the front of the emptying room, staring at the equation still glowing on the board. Her hands trembled. She wasn't sure if it was from anger or fear, because she knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. Mrs. Lancaster stood frozen, her fingers still clenched around a piece of chalk, her knuckles pale. Ethan Reyes had done something impossible, and everyone in that room knew it. Yet, instead of praise, instead of admiration, the only thing he saw in her eyes was something cold, something almost like fear. Just as she opened her mouth, about to say something that would undoubtedly crush whatever fragile moment had just formed, the door swung open. "What's going on here?" The voice was sharp, authoritative. Every head in the room turned toward the entrance. There, standing in the doorway, was Principal Alden, his graying eyebrows furrowed in confusion. His gaze swept the room, lingering on the chalkboard still filled with Ethan's impossible solution. And then, behind him, another man stepped in. A tall, distinguished figure with a neatly pressed suit and silver-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. His presence alone seemed to shift the very air in the classroom. He looked out of place here, a scholar among children. His eyes flickered across the room before locking onto the board. He paused mid-step. Mrs. Lancaster stiffened. Ethan sat perfectly still. The man inhaled sharply. "Who wrote this?" His voice carried something different. Not disbelief, not mockery, but wonder. The kind of awe that only someone who truly understood the depth of what they were seeing could express. No one spoke. The class, still unsure if they were even allowed to breathe after what had just happened, remained motionless. Ethan hesitated, his fingers twitching slightly as he clenched his hands under the desk. He swallowed hard before answering. I did." The professor turned fully to face him, his sharp eyes scanning him as though seeing right through him. There was no amusement, no condescension, only deep, intense curiosity. This is genius," he murmured, almost to himself, before stepping toward the board. He traced a hand in the air near the numbers, not quite touching the chalk but following the logic, the method, the impossible beauty of the solution. Mrs. Lancaster's lips pressed into a thin line. Her eyes darted from Ethan to the professor. She could feel it, slipping from her grasp. The control, the authority, the certainty she had held onto so tightly. Principal Alden cleared his throat, sensing the shift in power, but not yet understanding what had transpired. "Dr. Rowan, He paused, eyes darting toward the professor, whose mind was clearly elsewhere, still absorbed in the work on the board. "Ethan," the professor finally said, turning back toward him. "Do you know what you just did?" Ethan swallowed, unsure how to answer. He could feel every eye in the room on him, watching, waiting. "I just saw it," he said softly. It made sense. Dr. Rowan nodded slowly, his lips curving into a smile. It wasn't the smile of a teacher impressed with the student. It was the smile of a scientist discovering something extraordinary. "This is beyond impressive," he said. "This is revolutionary." Mrs. Lancaster's hands curled into fists. She wanted to speak, wanted to argue, to insist that this nobody child had somehow cheated. But she couldn't, because she knew the truth. Dr. Rowan turned back to Principal Alden. "This boy," he said, gesturing toward Ethan, "belongs somewhere he can be nurtured, where his mind can grow. I'd like to extend an invitation for him to visit Stanford's Youth Scholars Program. If he's interested, we can arrange a full scholarship." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Jake let out a low whistle. For once, there was no mockery in his voice, no sarcasm. Just pure, unfiltered shock. Ethan blinked. He didn't know what to say. A scholarship, to Stanford. It felt surreal, like something happening to someone else. Principal Alden nodded slowly. "That's quite the offer," he said, turning to Ethan. "Son, what do you think?" Ethan hesitated. He wasn't used to being asked what he thought. He wasn't used to mattering. His eyes flickered toward Mrs. Lancaster, almost unconsciously. He had spent so long believing what teachers like her made him feel, that he was invisible, that he was unworthy, that he was nothing. But now someone saw him. And not just anyone. Someone who understood exactly what he was. Ethan exhaled slowly. "I'd like that," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Mrs. Lancaster felt something crack inside her. This was it. The moment. The moment she had lost her son. But she wasn't losing Ethan. Not the same way. Maybe, just maybe, this time, she wouldn't ruin a child's gift. Maybe this time, she would step aside and let the brilliance shine instead of trying to cage it. For the first time, she spoke softly. "You should go," she said, her voice lacking its usual sharpness. "You don't belong here." Ethan blinked at her, startled. Not by the words themselves, but by the tone. There was no anger, no resentment, just something weary, something that almost sounded like relief. He nodded. The bell rang, signaling the end of the school day. Chairs scraped against the floor, the classroom erupting back into life as students hurried to leave, still buzzing with what they had just witnessed. But Ethan didn't rush. He stood, slinging his old backpack over his shoulder, his heart pounding in his chest. As he stepped toward the door, Jake McAllister moved out of his way. The bully who had spent years mocking him, calling him clueless Reyes, waiting for him to fail, didn't say a word. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt something shift. He walked to the door, stepping into the sunlight streaming through the windows. The warm afternoon light bathed his face, and for the first time, he felt it. He was seen. And this time, no one could take that away from him. Ethan Reyes walked out of that classroom a different person. The weight of years spent in the shadows had lifted, replaced by something new: recognition. He had shattered expectations, rewritten the rules, and proved that genius can come from anywhere. But this was just the beginning. What happens next? Will Ethan embrace his gift, or will the world try to bring him down? Stay tuned for more. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Let us know in the comments, what would you do if you had a hidden genius inside you?